Hello, Sidoris here again for more idiocy coming from the US White House. Well, now Donald Trump appears to be pursuing a 25% tariff on steel imports in the United States. And his premise for this is illustrated in his tweet here, suggesting that the USA is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country and that trade wars are good and that they're easy to win. Look, first of all, what does he mean when he says win a trade war? How do you win? What is the end goal of a trade war? Right? There's no end goal in mind, so you can never really win a trade war. What he's really trying to do is balance the trade deficit. He has correctly identified that the United States does not manufacture enough goods and that they are importing a lot on the confidence of the US dollar. In other words, the government is printing money, which circulates within the economy, and foreign sellers are selling their goods in exchange for that money. But at the end of the day, that money doesn't have any actual value. It's just an IOU printed by the Federal Reserve. So the problem with that is that using confidence as a currency, people are able to live beyond their means. But despite the fact that it is possible for them to print out as much money as they want, that doesn't mean that they can create confidence on the fly. If you don't start producing goods and services, then eventually your trade deficit might pop. Those international sellers who are holding US dollars could choose to sell those dollars at any time, and that could make it very expensive for consumers in the United States to purchase imports. So, I mean, at least Donald Trump is smart enough to identify that there is a problem here. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the government's job to fix it. But let's actually look at this and try to figure out what the effect that this trade war could potentially have on the US and its trading partners. Well, first, I accept the premise that a trade war will prop up the steel industry in the United States and it will even create some jobs. But let's be clear here, this is not creating any new value that doesn't already exist. All it's doing is taking value from other areas in the economy and spending it on the steel industry. So any value that is created for the US steel industry will be taken from any value that would have been created from foreign steel producers. But there's a reason that that steel wasn't made in the US in the first place. I mean, it's expensive to have steel shipped from Canada or from China or from, Europe or wherever the, US is getting all their steel from. It's very expensive. Why can't they just produce it locally? It's because it's very expensive to produce locally. And so when you force it to be produced locally at the higher price by imposing these tariffs, what happens is you impose a deadweight loss. And now you are paying for something that is less productive. So the higher prices that people will now be forced to pay for steel in order to buy steel from the overpriced US industry is a waste of scarce resources. You have to work in order to earn that money. Your labor is worth something to the economy, and now you have to squander that money away because you have to pay more to get the same steel that you should have been able to get cheaper from a more efficient foreign supplier. To illustrate the absurdity of this, imagine if you wanted to travel from New York City to Toronto. You have a few options here. The last time I took this route, I think I used Porter Airline, and I think it costed about $100 and took about, I don't know, let's say like an hour, maybe 2 hours if you consider traveling through the airport and customs. So we'll keep things really simple here. So that will be the option that we'll consider if I wanted to pay someone to take me from New York to Toronto. And the other option is that I can do it myself by walking. And according to Google Maps, this would take about 147 hours, and I'm not sure if that's considering the amount of time it would take to, sleep, because obviously you can't walk for 147 hours straight. But those are just details. The analogy is that the US government is making the decision that they don't want you to pay an airline to go from New York to Toronto. They want you to do it yourself because the United States is losing many billions of dollars on bad trade deals. But sure they are, but what's the opportunity cost of doing this yourself? Right? Like let's say that your time was only worth 10 bucks an hour. Still, If you were to walk for 147 hours in order to do it yourself, the true opportunity cost that you're paying is $1,470. And you're doing this in order to save $100. Even if the airline had a monopoly and they decide to price gouge and they decide to raise their prices up to $500 a flight, it would still be worth it to fly, assuming there were no other alternatives, because doing it yourself is more expensive after considering the opportunity cost. So doing it yourself is not the most economically efficient solution. Or another example would be, imagine if we applied this to another country that didn't have its own domestic airline and they relied on international airlines. So you have a choice. Either you can use a domestic bus, or you can use a international airline to reach your destination. Suppose it was an international destination. Well, the country could limit flights or tax flights in order to prop up their domestic bus services, but that wouldn't create any value. All it would do is shift value from an efficient means of locomotion to a much less efficient means of locomotion. And guess who pays the price for that? It's the consumers. Nay, not just consumers, businesses. See, when the government tries to play favoritism with special interest groups like this, they inevitably put down other corporations and other industry that rely on the industry that is now more expensive. For example, let's say that you were manufacturing cars. Well, you require steel to manufacture cars, and now the price of steel has gone up because of a tariff. So now your cars are more expensive. That means that you have to pass those prices on to your consumers. That means consumer prices are higher. It also means that your cars are now priced at a competitive disadvantage compared with foreign auto producers. So this tariff on international steel imports is going to hurt the US manufacturing industry in the auto sector. So what's the solution for that? More tariffs? Are you going to put tariffs on international vehicles as well? I got a better idea. Why don't you just stop trade altogether, abolish it? Let's just lock down all the borders and not allow Americans to buy any goods or services from any foreign producer, since that's obviously the most efficient solution to run the economy. No, it's completely asinine. Fuck, the only thing that's going to do is run the economy into the ground. But this will hurt the auto industry, and it will hurt it in more ways than one. See, the US exports cars to Canada, and now because Canadians will no longer be exporting as much steel to the US, it creates a trade deficit, which makes it more expensive for Canadians to import other US commodities. Hey, and guess what? Canadians buy an assload of cars from the US. There are other industries that are going to be affected as well. Agriculture, machinery, software, all of these things are going to be less accessible to Canadians. And that's the irony of these tariffs, is that they hurt the US economy more than they benefit it. President Trump is constantly talking about how he can win in a trade war. We don't even need a trade war. Canada does not need to respond in kind with tariffs in order for the US to lose this trade war. They've already lost. If they're going to impose these tariffs, the overall manufacturing and export sector within their economy is going to take damage. Now, obviously, I don't have the data to be able to quantify that effect for this video, but that effect is there, and it will be prevalent in the long run. Moving on, I want to address what this means for Canadians. So obviously, the Canadian steel industry is going to take a hit because they're not going to have as many sales to the US now that there is an unfair tax being imposed on their export. What about other Canadian industries? Consider the construction industry. Construction requires a lot of steel, but now the demand for Canadian steel has gone down because fewer Americans will be buying Canadian steel. So because of the laws of supply and demand, the price of steel will go down. So now it will be cheaper for Canadians to buy steel. Co-equally, it will be more expensive for Americans to buy steel. The ramifications of this can be felt far and wide. Steel is used for building condos. So now in Canada, it will be cheaper to build condos. In the United States, it will be more expensive to build condos. In Canada, the price of housing will either go down or it won't go up as much. In the United States, the cost of housing will go up higher than it would have had there not been a tariff on steel. That being said, long term, Canadians will be harmed in other ways. Like the price of food might go up because the price of importing food is going to go up because of the trade deficit. Another way to put it is that in order to compensate for the loss of that export, Canada is going to have to produce something else to fill the gap. And if they can't, then Canadians will just have to take a cut on what they consume. I want to be clear here that I'm not trying to be alarmist. It's not like this trade deficit is just out of whack and it's going to destroy the entire Canadian economy and make everything like really unaffordable. In fact, I think the trade deficit is like really small between Canada and the US. It's like almost zero. And the US tends to import slightly more than it exports. So I just want to put that into perspective. It's just going to be a minor budge in the direction of making things slightly more expensive. So Canadian consumption will decrease marginally. And overall, this effect might not even be a bad thing because it makes it cheaper for the US to buy other non-steel Canadian exports. Why? Because Canadians will have fewer stacks of US dollars kicking around, and so it increases the marginal value of a US dollar to a Canadian exporter. So here's a chart that kind of sums up who the winners and losers are in a trade war. Now, I want to emphasize that although there is a lot of value transfer going on here, this is technically not a zero-sum game because these tariffs are creating a deadweight loss, which actually ends up destroying value. So when you consider the macroeconomic system as a whole, everyone is a loser. I mean, sure, one person's loss is another person's gain, but the overall gain for society as a whole is negative. And I mean, it's negative for everyone. It's negative for Canada, and it's negative for the United States. So then why does the government want to push tariffs and trade wars so much if it destroys economic value? Well, we're not looking at the big picture here. There is another entity that I don't have listed on my chart who is actually a big winner when it comes to tariffs. Any guesses who it is? That's right, it's the US government. Despite the fact that a trade war would harm the US more than help it, politicians support the creation of tariffs because at the end of the day, this is about collecting money. And from the government's perspective, this is a win-win. Do you think the average voter understands this stuff? This is a classic case of the seen versus the unseen. Of course, Donald Trump is going to be championing all of these jobs he's going to be creating in the steel manufacturing industry, completely ignoring the fact that these redundant jobs are squandering opportunity costs away from other areas of the economy. That for every job created in the steel industry, there's a job that's being destroyed in the auto industry. My only conclusion can be that Trump doesn't give a shit about the economy. All he cares about is creating the illusion that he's helping the economy, even if the cure is worse than the disease. This is no different from one of those large corporations who will donate $10,000 to charity and then spend $5 million advertising about it. Absolutely wasteful and absolutely deceitful. But you know what? The average voter doesn't understand this stuff. That's where people like me and you can help. I'm helping by making this video, and you can help by sharing it. So click that subscribe button and share this video with your friends on social media. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.